The courtroom was thick with tension, a hush falling over the spectators. The eyes of the audience were locked on the small figure standing before the judge, Marcus Jackson, just 12 years old, but carrying the weight of a legal prodigy. His sharp gaze met that of Judge Richard Wallace, a man known for his decades of experience and unforgiving rulings. The judge, his silver hair gleaming under the bright lights, leaned forward in his seat, tapping his gavel lightly against the desk. His glasses reflected the fluorescent glow as his lips curved into an amused smile. "All right, young man," Judge Wallace said, his voice amused but stern. "Let's play a game, truth or lie. I'll ask you some questions, and we'll see if you can outsmart me. Sound fair?" A ripple of laughter went through the courtroom, but Marcus didn't laugh. He stood tall, his posture straight, dressed in a suit that, though too large for his small frame, somehow seemed to accentuate his confidence. His sharp brown eyes never wavered from the judge, and he simply nodded, signaling he was ready. The judge cleared his throat, settling back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. "First question," he began, his smile widening slightly. "The law states that a person is innocent until proven guilty. Truth or lie?" The entire courtroom leaned in, expecting a playful response, a child's answer that might stumble over the words, but Marcus, calm as ever, didn't hesitate. "Lie." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The judge raised an eyebrow, momentarily taken aback. "Lie? Care to explain?" His voice had shifted, now tinged with the first inkling of uncertainty. Marcus stood his ground, his voice steady, yet carrying an undeniable weight. "Because in reality," he said, "people are treated guilty first and have to prove their innocence, especially if they're black." His words hung in the air, the courtroom falling into stunned silence. Some murmured in agreement, while others whispered in shock. The judge's smile faded, his posture stiffening. He shifted in his seat, his eyes briefly scanning the crowd as if looking for something he hadn't expected. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "All right, let's try another one," he said, his tone less playful, more measured. "A judge must be completely fair and unbiased in every case. Truth or lie?" Marcus's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Lie," he answered smoothly, without hesitation. This time, the judge frowned, his brows knitting together. "Explain." "Because judges are human," Marcus replied, his voice unwavering. "And humans have biases, whether they admit it or not. You, for example, have already decided that I'm just a kid who doesn't know what he's talking about. That's your bias." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. The judge's face turned red, with a mixture of indignation and realization. The gavel slammed down sharply. "Order!" the judge barked, his voice cracking with anger. The room fell silent, everyone processing what had just transpired. For the first time, Judge Wallace seemed unsure. His confident demeanor was slipping, and it was clear that the boy standing before him was not just some child to be dismissed. Marcus stood there, unfazed, his gaze never leaving the judge. It was in that moment that the weight of the situation began to settle. This was no longer a game. The stakes had just been raised. The judge's expression darkened as he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. He had underestimated Marcus, and now he was facing the consequences. The courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary. A child, no older than a preteen, had just challenged the very foundation of the justice system, and in doing so had exposed its cracks. The audience could feel it. A shift in the air, a quiet understanding that something much larger was at play. This wasn't just about a game or a simple challenge to a judge's authority. Marcus had just opened a door to a deeper truth, one that would not be easily shut again. The judge's gavel came down once more, but this time it carried no certainty, no assurance of control. Marcus had revealed a side of the justice system that many refused to acknowledge, and the judge knew it. This was no longer just a case. This was a confrontation, and Marcus was the one calling the shots. The room remained eerily still as the realization spread. The cracks in the system had been exposed, and Marcus Jackson, the 12-year-old legal prodigy, had just set the stage for a battle that would shake the very foundation of the courtroom. And it was only just beginning. Marcus Jackson sat quietly in the corner of the public library, the soft rustling of pages filling the air as he absorbed the words on the pages of his book. The topic was nothing extraordinary for a 12-year-old, at least, not by Marcus's standards. His fingers gently flipped through the chapters of constitutional law. Principles and Practice, a book he had read cover to cover multiple times. For most kids his age, comic books or video games were the preferred distractions, but for Marcus, it was the law, the structure, the ideals, and the injustices that it so often failed to address that captured his full attention. In a room full of history books and digital encyclopedias, Marcus had always found himself drawn to the bound pages of legal texts. His love for law had bloomed as early as elementary school, when he would read about landmark court cases and the battles fought over civil rights. To him, the law wasn't just about rules. It was about righting the wrongs of society. It was about ensuring that justice would one day prevail, no matter who stood in the way. While his classmates spent their afternoons playing games or watching TV, Marcus found solace in the legal pages, developing a mind that was sharp and discerning far beyond his years. He had made it his mission to understand every nuance of the Constitution, to learn how it could be used to fight for justice, for fairness, and above all, for the truth. That afternoon in the library, Marcus wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. He was nestled in his favorite nook, a cozy spot by the window, far removed from the chaos outside. His mother, a single parent, trusted him to spend his time here, knowing he'd be safe and productive. But on this particular day, everything was about to change. The tranquility of the library was abruptly shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps. The murmurs of the patrons faded into an unsettling silence as a group of uniformed police officers burst into the library. Their heavy boots echoed through the aisles, and before Marcus could fully comprehend what was happening, he was surrounded. "Marcus Jackson!" one of the officers called out, his voice commanding and sharp. "You're under arrest for the robbery that occurred at the Quick Mart on 5th and Pine." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, their weight crushing against Marcus's chest. Robbery? How could that be? He was just here, reading his book, minding his own business. His heart pounded as the officer handcuffed him with swift, practiced motions. Marcus barely reacted. It wasn't fear he felt. It was confusion, frustration, and above all, a growing sense of disbelief. He had done nothing wrong. There was no reason for this arrest. Yet the officer's hands on his arms were firm, their eyes filled with an assumption that wasn't about to be questioned. A vague description, a young black male in a hoodie, was all they had. And that was enough to bring Marcus here, to drag him away from his innocent afternoon, away from the place he felt safest. His mother, who had been sitting at a nearby table, stood up in panic, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What's going on? Why are you taking my son?" she demanded, her voice shaking. But the officers didn't respond. They simply moved, taking Marcus with them as he was led out of the library. He didn't resist. In his mind, he was already calculating his next move, formulating his defense, his case. The wheels of justice would turn eventually, he knew that. But for now, he had to endure. News of the incident spread quickly. The video of Marcus's arrest went viral almost immediately, circulating across social media and drawing widespread attention. The outcry was immediate. People were angry. They were furious at the injustice of it all. How could the police arrest a child based on such a flimsy description? How could they drag him away from his quiet life without even a shred of evidence? The public's response was swift and unforgiving, and soon the media descended upon the case, fueling the flames of outrage. Pundits, activists, and ordinary citizens all rallied behind Marcus, demanding answers. The hashtag #JusticeForMarcus flooded every social platform, and protests broke out in his name. But amidst the chaos and uproar, Marcus remained unfazed. He was aware of the growing media storm, but he didn't let it distract him. Instead, he focused on the facts, on the law, and on the truth. His mother, though deeply shaken by the ordeal, did her best to comfort him, urging him to stay calm. But she, too, was worried. Her heart ached as she watched her son, so young and so capable, face the possibility of being lost in a system that didn't seem to care about his innocence. She called their public defender, a well-meaning woman named Grace Carter, who promised to help. But even Grace's reassurances couldn't fully calm Marcus's mother's nerves. She feared for the future, for what this could mean for Marcus, for their family. Marcus, however, was not afraid. In fact, he was eerily calm. He had been wrongfully arrested, yes, but he knew that he would not be swallowed by the system. He had read enough, studied enough, and understood enough to know that this was not just about him. It was about the countless others who had been wrongly accused, mistreated, and forgotten. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. The courtroom that awaited him was about to witness something unlike anything it had ever seen before. A 12-year-old boy, not an adult lawyer, was about to take the stand. The weight of the accusations, the biases of the system, and the assumptions that had been made about him would all be put to the test. Marcus would prove that the system, flawed and unjust as it was, had underestimated him. And as he stood tall in the face of this battle, his mind remained focused, his resolve unshaken. It was his calmness, his intelligence, and his unwavering belief in the law that would make him a beacon of hope for those who still believed in justice, for those who still dared to challenge a broken system. Marcus Jackson was not just a 12-year-old kid caught in a mess of police incompetence. He was a force that would not be stopped. And this, he knew, was just the beginning of a much larger fight. The courtroom buzzed with the quiet murmurs of spectators and reporters as Marcus Jackson, now seated at the defendant's table, prepared for the trial that would determine his fate. At just 12 years old, he was no stranger to legal terminology, having spent countless hours poring over case studies, statutes, and legal textbooks. But today, in this room filled with adults, he would face a test unlike any other. The judge, Richard Wallace, had been known for his harsh rulings, his no-nonsense approach, and his firm belief in the letter of the law. He leaned forward in his chair, eyeglasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose as he studied Marcus. The young boy, dressed in a suit that seemed a size too big for him, sat with the confidence of someone far older. His sharp brown eyes were calm, unwavering. He was not a typical defendant, and everyone in the room could sense that. "So, young man," Judge Wallace began, his voice dripping with amusement, "I see you've decided to represent yourself today. Bold move. I hope you realize the gravity of the situation." His tone was light, almost playful, as he glanced down at the papers in front of him, already dismissing the idea that a 12-year-old could possibly know enough to navigate a courtroom. Marcus didn't flinch. He met the judge's eyes and replied in a steady, assured voice, "I do, Your Honor, and I'm ready." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but skeptical. "Very well. Let's see how well you understand the law." The prosecutor, a tall man with a stiff, confident posture, stood up to present the case. He was Mr. Callahan, the kind of prosecutor who rarely lost a case, and his belief in the system had always been unshaken. But today, there was an unfamiliar tension in his stance as he addressed the court. The case against Marcus seemed airtight, or so they thought. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Callahan began, his voice smooth, We have video footage that places the defendant in the vicinity of the crime scene at the time of the robbery, along with a witness who identified him. We are confident that the evidence is clear." He motioned to the screen where a grainy black-and-white video flickered to life. The image was blurry, a vague figure in a hoodie walking past a convenience store. The video did little to identify the person beyond the vague description given by the witness. Marcus watched the video impassively, his mind already working. He had seen this footage before. It proved nothing. It was an image of a person in a hoodie, just like so many others in the city. The blurry image did not even show the person's face, let alone provide any definitive evidence of guilt. But Marcus didn't speak yet. He knew the prosecution was only getting started, and this was just the beginning. "The witness, Mr. Hayes," Callahan continued, "has positively identified the defendant as the person he saw loitering near the store just minutes before the robbery occurred. The description given was that of a young black male wearing a hoodie." He turned to Marcus with a smug grin. "Seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it?" Marcus stood up slowly, his suit sleeves hanging loosely around his arms. He approached the judge, his posture straight and dignified, before speaking calmly to the court. "Your Honor, I object." The room went silent. Callahan's face faltered for just a second, surprised that the boy had dared to interrupt him. "Objection? On what grounds?" he sneered. Marcus didn't hesitate. "The prosecution has presented no concrete evidence that connects me to the crime, Your Honor. A blurry video and a vague description are not sufficient to prove that I was involved in the robbery. The fact that I was in the vicinity of the store doesn't mean I committed a crime." Judge Wallace's eyes narrowed. "Your argument is noted, but you still have to prove your innocence." Marcus nodded, confident in his response. "I don't need to prove my innocence, Your Honor. I am innocent until proven guilty." He paused, looking around the courtroom. "It is the prosecution that must prove I am guilty, not the other way around." The judge's lips curled into a thin smile. "All right, young man. Go ahead. Present your case. But remember, the burden of proof is on you." Marcus turned back toward the prosecutor, addressing the courtroom with the same calm demeanor. "As I mentioned, the prosecution has no proof of my involvement in the robbery. The video footage is inconclusive. The witness's description is so vague that it could apply to anyone who fits the general description of a young black male in a hoodie. How can we be sure that I'm the one they saw? How can we be sure that anyone is?" Callahan's eyes narrowed as he tried to regain control of the situation, but Marcus wasn't finished. Marcus pointed toward the screen, where the blurry video still played. "This video doesn't show a clear face. There's no distinguishing feature. It's simply someone walking near a store, which is not enough to convict anyone of anything." He turned to the judge, his voice now more commanding. "In fact, Your Honor, I ask that we consider the possibility that I wasn't even in the area at the time of the crime. If the prosecution cannot prove with solid evidence that I was there, then the case should be dismissed." The room was tense. Even the judge seemed to be thinking about Marcus's words. The prosecutor fumbled with his notes, trying to come up with a counter-argument, but Marcus had already laid the foundation for his defense. "Now," Marcus continued, "I would like to submit evidence of my whereabouts at the time of the robbery. I was at the public library, reading a book. I have my library checkout records that prove I was there at the time the crime occurred. The timestamp on the receipt is irrefutable." He turned to the bailiff, who handed over the document. Marcus presented it to the judge with calm authority. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as Judge Wallace read the library receipt. It showed that Marcus had checked out a book at 8:42 p.m., exactly 8 minutes after the robbery, which had taken place at 8:40 p.m. The evidence was clear. Marcus's calm, logical approach left the courtroom in stunned silence. The prosecutor was left stammering, his carefully crafted case unraveling before his eyes. There was nothing left to argue. No video, no witness testimony, no solid evidence. Judge Wallace cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he looked up from the receipt. "It seems, Mr. Jackson, that you've made a compelling argument," he said slowly. "The evidence presented by the prosecution is weak, to say the least." The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone waited for the judge's next words. Would he dismiss the case outright, or would he allow the prosecution to continue with its weak argument? After a long, drawn-out moment, Judge Wallace looked up at Marcus. "You've done well, young man. I must admit, I underestimated you." The respect in his voice was hard to ignore. The crowd remained silent, awestruck by the 12-year-old's ability to stand tall against the weight of the legal system. Marcus had just proven that the system was broken, that it was based on assumptions and stereotypes rather than hard evidence. The prosecutor, now looking defeated, sat down, unable to respond. Marcus, however, stood tall, his heart beating steadily, knowing this was only the beginning. He had exposed the cracks in the system, and now the truth was laid bare for everyone to see. The courtroom, once buzzing with a mix of disbelief and tension, fell into a stunned silence as Marcus Jackson stood tall, the evidence of his innocence in hand. The moment he presented the library checkout record, the judge, Judge Wallace, had no choice but to acknowledge the flaw in the prosecution's case. Marcus's calm, assured demeanor sent ripples through the courtroom as the audience realized that a 12-year-old child had just single-handedly exposed the weakness of the charges against him. Judge Wallace had already expressed his admiration for Marcus's argument, but the case wasn't over yet. The prosecutor, Mr. Callahan, remained seated, glaring at the boy with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. His attempt to control the courtroom had fallen apart under Marcus's sharp logic. The pieces of the case were beginning to crumble, but Callahan, despite the overwhelming evidence, was not ready to back down. "You can't seriously expect to get away with this," Callahan muttered under his breath, staring at the receipt in disbelief. His face reddened as he shifted in his chair, his pride shattered. Marcus didn't respond to the prosecutor's venomous mutterings. He simply stood there, his posture unwavering, watching as the prosecution struggled to gather themselves. The judge adjusted his glasses, then turned to Callahan. "Mr. Callahan," Judge Wallace said with a heavy sigh, his voice laced with a tone of finality, "do you have any further evidence to present, or should we prepare to conclude this case?" The prosecutor's face twitched. He knew the case was falling apart, but his professional pride refused to allow him to give up. He stood up again, trying to regain his composure. "Your Honor, the video footage, while not conclusive, still places the defendant in the general vicinity of the crime scene. And the witness—" Marcus raised his hand, interrupting. "But it doesn't place me at the crime scene, does it?" His voice was calm, but his words sliced through the air like a blade. "It's just a blurry image of someone who could be anyone. That's not proof. It's a suggestion, and suggestions don't carry weight in a courtroom." Callahan gritted his teeth, trying to maintain control, but he could feel the weight of Marcus's words and the growing doubt in the minds of the courtroom audience. His frustration boiled over, but he fought to keep his anger in check. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Callahan spat, his voice tight with the strain of losing. "This is a serious crime. You think you've won because of a library checkout? You think that proves your innocence?" Marcus didn't flinch. He looked directly at Callahan, his eyes steady and unwavering. "No, Mr. Callahan," he said softly. "It's not the checkout that proves my innocence. It's the fact that you and the police jumped to conclusions without a shred of real evidence. That's the problem here. Your assumptions about who I am, about what I look like, about what I could or couldn't have done, are what brought us to this point." The words landed like a thunderclap in the courtroom. Marcus was no longer just defending himself. He was challenging the very core of the system, that had allowed this injustice to happen. The audience sat in stunned silence, realizing that this wasn't just about a wrongful arrest. It was about the biases and assumptions that led to so many injustices, especially in marginalized communities. The prosecutor fumed, but he had no argument left. Marcus had exposed the flaws in every piece of the case. But just as the room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, something unexpected happened. A police officer rushed into the courtroom, out of breath, holding a manila folder in his hand. The officer moved quickly toward Judge Wallace, his expression tense and urgent. "Your Honor, we have an update on the case," the officer said, his voice shaky with urgency. Judge Wallace motioned for the officer to approach. The officer handed the folder to the judge, who scanned its contents quickly. The courtroom held its breath as the tension in the air grew palpable. A few moments passed before Judge Wallace spoke, his voice now grim. "The real suspect," he began, "has just been apprehended, and he has confessed to both the robbery at the Quick Mart and the one Marcus Jackson was accused of." The room erupted in a mix of astonished gasps and hushed whispers. Marcus felt a flicker of relief in his chest, but the relief was short-lived. He looked at the officer, then at the judge, sensing that something was not quite right. The pieces were falling into place, but something about the timing of the arrest felt too convenient. Marcus had been right all along. This was not just a simple case of mistaken identity. This was something bigger. "Your Honor," Marcus spoke up before the judge could continue, his voice steady and clear. "I'm glad the real suspect has been caught, but I need to ask, how did he confess so quickly? A suspect doesn't usually confess so easily, especially when they know they're guilty of something else." The courtroom went silent again as Marcus's question hung in the air. It was a simple question, but it cut straight to the heart of the issue. The real suspect had been caught breaking into another store, and within minutes he had confessed to both robberies. That kind of confession didn't happen by accident. There was something about the situation that felt staged, rehearsed. Judge Wallace looked at Marcus, his expression darkening. "Mr. Jackson," he said, his voice tense, "I can see where you're going with this, but the confession is undeniable." Marcus wasn't convinced. He stood up slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not so sure, Your Honor. This smells like a cover-up. I know how the system works, and this doesn't add up." The courtroom erupted into a new round of murmurs as people began to understand the gravity of what Marcus was implying. The case, which seemed to be coming to a close, had now taken an unexpected turn. "Your Honor," Marcus continued, his voice rising with the intensity of his conviction, "I'm not saying this man isn't guilty, but the timing of his confession, how quickly it came, and how conveniently it happened after my case began to fall apart. It's all too convenient. The police arrested me with no real evidence. They rushed through the process, and now they've captured a suspect just in time to make it all go away. But this isn't over. Something doesn't feel right." The courtroom was on edge as Marcus spoke. The prosecution, unable to respond, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The officer, who had delivered the confession news, stood frozen, his face paling under the pressure. Judge Wallace sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples, deep in thought. He had been trained to make judgments based on facts. But now, faced with a young boy who was asking all the right questions, he began to realize that Marcus might be onto something far bigger than just a wrongful arrest. "We will take a short recess," Judge Wallace announced, his voice heavy with tension. "We need to review this new information thoroughly." As the court adjourned, Marcus's mind raced. He had exposed the flaws in the case, but now he sensed something darker lurking beneath the surface. The police had acted quickly, too quickly, and Marcus was certain that they weren't done yet. There was more to this than a simple case of mistaken identity. He could feel it. As he walked back to his seat, His mother, who had been sitting quietly beside him throughout the trial, leaned in and whispered, "Do you think we're finished with this?" Marcus looked at her, his gaze sharp, his confidence growing, even as the weight of the situation grew heavier. "No, Mom. This isn't over. It's just beginning." The stakes had been raised. The truth was closer, but the danger was now more real than ever. And Marcus, the 12-year-old prodigy who had already challenged the system, knew that the real fight was only just beginning. The days following Marcus's trial were filled with a sense of both victory and unease. The courtroom had erupted when the real suspect was caught, but Marcus's instincts told him that something deeper and darker was at play. The timing of the confession, the way the suspect had seemingly admitted to both robberies without hesitation, felt too convenient. It was as though the police were rushing to wrap up the case before anyone could dig too deeply. Marcus, determined to uncover the truth, had spent the next several days poring over every detail of the case. He spent hours at the library, poring through public records and police reports, his mind working tirelessly to piece together the fragments of evidence. It didn't take long for him to uncover something unsettling, something that would change the course of the investigation. The arrest of Nathaniel Brooks, the man who had supposedly committed the robbery, didn't add up. According to the records, Brooks had been arrested an hour before the crime had even taken place. Marcus's heart raced as he stared at the arrest record, the confusion setting in. If Brooks had been arrested before the robbery occurred, then how could he possibly have committed the crime? It was a glaring contradiction, one that made the entire arrest and subsequent confession feel like a setup. Marcus knew that if this was true, it wasn't just about a mistaken identity. This was something much bigger, something far more dangerous. He realized that the police had either fabricated the entire arrest or had been part of a much larger conspiracy to cover up the truth. It wasn't just a matter of proving his own innocence anymore. It was about exposing the corruption within the system, and he knew that it wasn't going to be easy. As he delved deeper into the records, Marcus began to feel the weight of the situation. He knew he was getting closer to something that the people in charge didn't want him to find. His search for the truth didn't go unnoticed. Within days, Marcus began to receive threatening messages. It started small, with anonymous phone calls and cryptic notes slipped under his door. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, but the messages grew more aggressive, more direct. The threats became harder to ignore. His mother had noticed it too. She had seen the look in his eyes, the deep concentration and the exhaustion as he spent long hours in front of his computer, connecting dots that no one else could see. But she had also seen the fear beginning to creep into his face, the way his shoulders tensed whenever he stepped outside the house. She had known something was wrong, but had hoped that it was just the stress of the trial getting to him. Now she saw the truth. The pressure was mounting, and her son was in danger. One evening, after Marcus had returned from another long day of investigating, his mother sat him down in their modest living room. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice trembling with concern, "you need to stop. Whatever you're doing, whatever you're looking into, it's not worth it. Please listen to me. They're watching you. They've been watching us for days now. You need to let this go." But Marcus shook his head, his eyes unwavering. "Mom, I can't stop. Not now. If I don't keep going, nothing will change. They'll just keep getting away with it, and they'll do this to someone else." His mother's hands wrung nervously in her lap. "But Marcus, they're dangerous. Whoever is behind this whole thing, they don't care about the law. They'll hurt you to protect their secrets. I've seen this kind of thing before. People like that. They don't stop until they've silenced everyone who gets too close." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He understood the fear in his mother's voice, but he couldn't back down. not when he was so close to the truth. "I know, Mom," he said quietly. "I know what I'm up against. But I have to do this. For me, for everyone. I have to expose them." It was then that Marcus began to realize just how deep the corruption went. The police department wasn't just incompetent. It was actively covering its tracks, manipulating the system to protect the people at the top. The higher-ups in the force were involved in something much larger than just a wrongful arrest. They were protecting the criminals within their own ranks, turning a blind eye to the real criminals in exchange for power and money. As Marcus's investigation continued, the threats became more direct. One evening, as he was returning home, he noticed a black SUV parked across the street from his house. At first he thought it was just a coincidence, but then he saw the same vehicle again the next night and the night after that. He knew he was being watched. His every move, his every phone call was being tracked. The weight of the situation pressed down on him as he realized the danger was no longer just theoretical. It was real, and it was coming for him. That's when Captain Reynolds, the officer who had been involved in Marcus's arrest, came into the picture. Reynolds was a tall, imposing man with a hard expression that made people uneasy. He had been watching Marcus closely from the start, but now he made his move. One afternoon, Marcus was sitting at his computer when he received an unexpected knock at the door. He opened it to find Captain Reynolds standing in the doorway, a dark look on his face. "Marcus Jackson," Reynolds said coldly, his eyes narrowing. "You need to stop digging into things that don't concern you. You're playing with fire, kid. You don't know what you're getting into." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He'd known the threats were coming, but hearing them from Reynolds, someone who clearly had power and influence, made the danger feel real. "I'm not going to stop," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. "You've already tried to cover this up, but I won't let you. I know what you're doing, and I'm going to expose it." Reynolds stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You don't know who you're messing with," he said, his voice low and menacing. "If you don't stop now, you're going to regret it. You and your family are going to regret it." Marcus didn't flinch, but he could feel his pulse racing. "You can't scare me," he said, his words coming out sharper than he intended. Reynolds' eyes narrowed, his face hardening. "Don't test me, Marcus. You're a smart kid, but you're in over your head. The people I work with, well, let's just say they don't play by the rules. You keep poking around, and you'll find yourself in a situation you can't get out of." With that, Reynolds turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing in the doorway, his mind racing. Marcus knew that Reynolds was more than just a cop with a bad attitude. He was part of something much bigger, a network of corrupt officials who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. As the days passed, Marcus's fears grew. The threats became more frequent, more intense, and it was clear that the police weren't just trying to intimidate him, they were trying to silence him. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He had come this far, and he knew that exposing the truth was the only way to stop the corruption that had plagued the system for so long. Yet, as he continued to push forward, Marcus began to wrestle with a moral dilemma. Exposing the truth meant putting his own safety at risk, his family's safety too. He had seen the lengths people would go to in order to protect their power, and he knew that once the truth came out, there would be no going back. But the thought of letting the system continue to manipulate innocent people ate at him, and he knew he couldn't stay silent. His resolve only grew stronger. He had to do what was right, even if it meant sacrificing his own safety. The stakes were high, but Marcus had already proven that he wasn't afraid to challenge the system. And now, more than ever, he was determined to finish what he had started, no matter the cost. Marcus Jackson had always been driven by a deep sense of justice, a belief that the truth was worth fighting for, no matter the odds. But as the stakes grew higher, so did the dangers. The more he uncovered about the corrupt web surrounding Captain Reynolds and the police force, the more he realized that exposing the truth would require more than just his sharp mind and quick wit. It would require action. Bold, dangerous action. But Marcus wasn't alone in this fight. He had a plan, and with the help of his Aunt Vanessa, a skilled defense attorney, and his best friend Elijah, he was about to take the next step toward dismantling the corruption that had haunted his life for far too long. The first step in the plan was simple: track the movements of Captain Reynolds. Vanessa had connections, and it didn't take long before she managed to dig up something disturbing. Reynolds, the man who had threatened Marcus, wasn't just a rogue cop. He was connected to a private security firm that handled sensitive government matters. The firm, named Helio Security, had access to classified information and high-level contracts with government agencies, including law enforcement. Marcus and Vanessa suspected that Reynolds had been using his position as a cop to cover up illegal activities for powerful figures, using the firm to launder money and manipulate cases. But they needed proof that would be impossible for anyone to deny. They quickly formulated a plan. Marcus, with his unparalleled hacking skills, would infiltrate Helio Security's system, retrieving any incriminating evidence. Elijah, ever the willing accomplice, would create a distraction to ensure that Marcus and Vanessa could move freely through the building. It was dangerous, risky, and reckless, but it was the only way they would be able to expose the truth and put an end to the corruption that had threatened their lives for so long. The trio made their way to Washington, D.C., where Helio Security's headquarters was located. The sleek, glass-covered building stood like a fortress, towering over the surrounding streets. As they approached, Marcus felt a familiar knot in his stomach, a combination of excitement and anxiety. This was it, the culmination of everything they had worked for. But as they neared the entrance, a sinking feeling settled in. They were no longer just up against a corrupt cop. They were taking on a system, a network of powerful individuals who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. They entered the building under the guise of a routine visit, their hearts pounding in their chests as they passed through the lobby. The receptionist barely glanced up as they approached, and Vanessa flashed her credentials, which allowed them access to certain areas of the building. Elijah, ever the natural actor, struck up a conversation with the receptionist, distracting her while Marcus and Vanessa slipped through a side door and made their way toward the secured floors. The building was immaculate, sterile, sleek, and cold. But there was an oppressive energy in the air, as though something dark was lurking just beneath the surface. The further they moved into the building, the more Marcus's sense of danger heightened. They reached the floor containing the main servers, where the sensitive information was stored. It was a high-security area, with keycard access required to get in, but Vanessa had prepared for that. She had managed to get hold of a card that would grant them entry. Once inside, Marcus immediately went to work. He set up his laptop, connecting to the network and bypassing the firewalls with ease. The server room hummed with the low sound of machinery, but all Marcus could hear was the pounding of his own heart. This was it, the moment of truth. As he navigated through the system, Elijah continued to create distractions by causing minor commotions in the lobby, making sure no one suspected anything. Hours passed as Marcus hacked deeper into the files, the pressure mounting. The weight of what they were doing, the risks they were taking, was becoming palpable. But Marcus pushed forward, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, eyes scanning the files for any piece of information that would tie Reynolds and the police force to the corrupt network they were trying to expose. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he found it. Evidence, documents, communications, and financial records, all pointing to a network of officers, politicians, and business leaders involved in money laundering, bribery, and manipulation. They were all connected, all profiting from the system's rot. Marcus knew this was the smoking gun they had been looking for, but just as he was about to transfer the files, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Someone was coming. He quickly clicked through the files, preparing to download everything onto his hard drive, but it was too late. The door burst open, and a team of security guards stormed into the room, weapons drawn. "Freeze! Hands in the air!" one of the guards shouted, his voice gruff and commanding. Marcus's mind raced. He had to think quickly. There was no way out, no time to escape. Without hesitating, he pressed a button on his laptop to send the files to an encrypted cloud storage, ensuring the evidence would be safe, even if they were caught. Then, as the guards closed in, Marcus grabbed his hard drive, shoving it into his bag and standing up slowly, his hands raised. "Don't shoot," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice calm, his eyes darting toward Vanessa, who was already positioning herself between him and the guards. The guards didn't hesitate. They moved forward, closing in on Marcus and Vanessa. Just then, Elijah burst into the room, knocking over a stack of chairs in the hallway, drawing attention and causing a distraction. The guards turned, momentarily distracted by the noise, giving Marcus the split second he needed to act. "Go!" Marcus shouted, as he darted toward the door, with Vanessa and Elijah following closely behind. They ran, pushing through the narrow hallway as the sound of footsteps and shouts echoed behind them. They reached the stairwell, and without looking back, they raced down the stairs, their breath coming in sharp gasps. The security guards were right on their heels, and the building seemed to come alive with urgency. They rounded a corner and burst out into the parking garage, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the screeching of tires as they reached the exit. Marcus's mind was racing, but there was no time to think. They had to get out of the building, and fast. As they ran, a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of them, blocking their path. The door flew open, and Marcus's heart sank as he saw the familiar face of Captain Reynolds standing outside the vehicle. "This ends now," Reynolds said, his voice cold and menacing. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He didn't stop running. He could see the light at the end of the tunnel, the exit. He wasn't going to let them win. Vanessa acted quickly, pulling a gun from her jacket and firing a warning shot into the air. "Get in the car!" she shouted, as the security team hesitated, unsure of how to react. Without looking back, Marcus and Elijah scrambled into the SUV, and Vanessa slammed the door shut. The car sped out of the garage, tires screeching as they raced through the city streets. Behind them, Reynolds and his men were hot on their trail, but Vanessa expertly weaved through traffic, taking sharp turns and evasive maneuvers to shake off their pursuers. The adrenaline surged through Marcus's veins as they sped through the streets, the weight of what they had just done settling over him. They had the evidence. The truth was finally in their hands. But the battle was far from over. The people they were up against were powerful, dangerous, and desperate. They would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. As they neared a safe house on the outskirts of the city, Vanessa glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "You did it, Marcus," she said, her voice a mix of pride and concern. "You got us the proof." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already working. They had the evidence, but the fight was just beginning. "We've only just started," he said, his voice steady. "Now we take them down." The car raced toward the horizon, carrying with it the promise of justice, truth, and a fight that would never end as long as Marcus had breath in his lungs. The moment Marcus and his team managed to escape from the private security firm, the tension that had been building for days finally began to dissipate. But their victory was bittersweet. They had the evidence, the smoking gun, that would expose the corruption festering within the very institutions that were supposed to protect and serve. But the danger was far from over. Captain Reynolds and the network of corrupt officials behind him hadn't been defeated. They had simply retreated, hiding in the shadows as they plotted their next move. Back at the safe house, the trio huddled around the laptop as Marcus uploaded the files to an encrypted server, making sure that the evidence was stored in multiple locations, far from the reach of those who would try to destroy it. The tension in the room was palpable, but so was the exhilaration. The weight of the situation, the risks they had taken, was finally beginning to settle in. Marcus glanced at Vanessa, who sat across from him, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. Elijah, sitting beside her, stared at the screen, his face a mix of disbelief and awe. It was hard to comprehend how far they had come, how much they had risked to uncover the truth. "Do you think it's enough?" Elijah asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze focused on the glowing screen. "It has to be," he replied. "We have the evidence. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been wronged by the system." Vanessa nodded, her eyes hardening with determination. "It's not just about what we've uncovered. It's about how we use it. We can't let them silence us. This goes beyond just one case. We have a chance to expose a network of corruption that's been festering for years." The next few hours were a blur. They worked together to craft a plan for getting the evidence out to the public. Marcus knew they couldn't do it alone. They needed the world to see the truth. They reached out to trusted journalists, individuals who had fought for justice in the past and who weren't afraid of the consequences. They also reached out to activists, groups that had been fighting against police corruption for years. The message was clear. The system was broken, and it needed to be fixed. As soon as the story broke, it exploded across news outlets. The world was shaken by the scale of the corruption. News stations, social media platforms, and newspapers all carried the story, spreading like wildfire. The revelations were staggering. Politicians, law enforcement officers, and private security firms all involved in a web of illegal activities, bribery, and cover-ups. People were outraged. Protests erupted across the country, demanding accountability from those who had used their positions of power to exploit the system. The voices of the people grew louder with every passing day. Demands for reform filled the air. People marched in the streets, rallied for justice, and made their voices heard in the halls of power. It was the beginning of something monumental, a movement, a call for change that could no longer be ignored. But even as the world took notice, Marcus knew the fight was far from over. Despite the public outrage, Captain Reynolds and the other corrupt officials hadn't been apprehended. They had simply gone underground, retreating into the shadows where they could regroup and plot their next move. The system had been exposed, but the powers behind it were far from defeated. "We did it," Elijah said one evening, his voice full of pride. "We brought the truth to light. People are talking about it. The world is changing." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He knew that while the truth had come to light, the forces they were up against were powerful, and they wouldn't stop. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Reynolds and his people, they're still out there. They're just waiting for the right moment to strike back. We can't stop now." Vanessa looked at Marcus, her expression softening. "You're right. But we've made a difference. The people know the truth. They're not going to let them get away with it." Marcus nodded, though his mind was still racing. He had spent so many hours digging into the depths of the system, pulling apart the lies and exposing the corruption that had been allowed to flourish. But what about the future? What about the next time someone like Reynolds tried to manipulate the system for their own gain? Marcus knew that the work was just beginning. The fight for justice would never be easy, and it would never be over. But he was ready. As he sat alone later that night, staring out of the window of the safe house, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the people who had helped him along the way, his mother, who had stood by him even when the world seemed determined to tear them apart, Vanessa, who had taught him that fighting for justice meant more than just knowing the law. It meant being willing to risk everything to make the world better, and Elijah, who had been his best friend and partner in this fight, standing by his side when the odds seemed insurmountable. He had changed, there was no doubt about it. He was no longer just the smart kid reading about constitutional law in the library. He was a fighter, a person who understood that justice wasn't something you could simply read about in books. It was something you had to live and breathe, something you had to fight for every day. But the world had changed too. The truth had been exposed, and that, in itself, was a victory. But as Marcus sat there, he knew that his journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. He wasn't going to stop until the system was truly reformed, until the people who had used their power for their own gain were held accountable. He wasn't going to stop until there was true justice for everyone. The world had taken its first step toward change, but Marcus knew that the road ahead would be long and hard. But he wasn't afraid. In fact, he was more determined than ever. The fight for justice wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about ensuring that the truth led to real change. And as long as Marcus was breathing, he would continue the fight. The story didn't end with the corruption exposed. It didn't end with the protests or the news coverage. The fight for justice was a journey, one that would continue for as long as there were wrongs to right. And Marcus Jackson, the 12-year-old who had dared to challenge the system, would be there every step of the way. The fight was far from over, and Marcus, now more than ever, was ready to lead the charge. Years had passed since the events that had shaped Marcus Jackson into a figure of justice and resilience. Now, standing at the podium of a crowded conference hall, his gaze swept across the room. Hundreds of faces, each with a story to tell, each with a reason to be here, to listen to the words of a young man who had fought and won against the very system that had once tried to destroy him. It had been a long road from that fateful day in the courtroom, when Marcus had stood before Judge Wallace, his voice steady as he exposed the flaws in a corrupt system. He had been only 12 then, with a fierce belief in justice and the truth. Now, at 18, he was a symbol of hope for so many who had felt powerless against the weight of the world. Marcus had seen firsthand how deep the corruption ran, how those who held the power could manipulate the system to protect their own interests. But in the years since, he had also seen the power of people coming together, standing up for what was right, demanding accountability, and fighting for a better world. The fight for justice, he had learned, was not a singular battle. It was a collective effort, a journey that required strength, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to the truth. He could still remember the fear, the uncertainty, the sleepless nights spent wondering if the next move would be his last. He could still recall the threats, the danger that had loomed over him and his family. But more than anything, Marcus remembered the day when everything had changed, the moment when the truth had come to light and the world had stood up and said, "Enough." Looking back, Marcus could see how much he had grown. He wasn't just the young boy who had fought for his innocence anymore. He had become a leader, someone who understood that the struggle for justice didn't end with a victory in a courtroom or a media headline. It was an ongoing fight, one that demanded constant vigilance, courage, and an unyielding belief that the truth would always prevail, no matter how dark the world seemed. As he spoke to the crowd, Marcus thought about the people who had helped him along the way, his family, his friends, the activists who had rallied behind him, the journalists who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. They had all been part of the movement that had sparked a fire in the hearts of millions. They had all been part of the reason that justice had prevailed, even when the odds had seemed insurmountable. But now, standing before this audience, Marcus knew that the real work was still ahead. The world had changed, but it had not changed enough. The fight for justice was never over. It was a fight that had to be carried on, generation after generation, because as long as injustice existed, there would always be a need for people to rise up and challenge it. "I stand before you today," Marcus began, his voice steady and strong, "not as a hero, not as a leader, but as a person who has seen the power of the truth and the strength of those who fight for it. I've been where many of you are right now, feeling like the world is stacked against you, feeling like the system is too broken to fix. But I can tell you this. The truth is more powerful than any lie. And when enough people come together and say, "We've had enough," that's when change happens. It starts with one voice, one person, willing to stand up, to speak out, and to demand justice. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word, as Marcus continued. I was a 12-year-old kid who stood in a courtroom and faced down the system that tried to bury me. I didn't do it alone. None of us ever do. We fight for what's right because we believe in a world where truth and justice aren't just ideals. They are the foundation of everything we do. But that fight is ongoing. It doesn't end with one victory, one case, one scandal. We have to keep pushing, keep questioning, keep demanding accountability, no matter how hard it gets. Marcus paused for a moment, his eyes sweeping across the room. The fight for justice isn't easy. It's messy. It's difficult, and it will break you if you let it. But if you can push through the pain, if you can hold on to your belief in what's right, you will find strength in ways you never imagined. And that strength will carry you through the darkest moments. It will push you to keep going, even when the odds are stacked against you. He let the words sink in, allowing the weight of them to settle over the crowd. I know that some of you may be here today, wondering if it's even possible to make a difference. You may be wondering if your voice can really change anything. And I'm here to tell you, yes. Your voice matters. Your actions matter. Every single one of us has the power to make a change. You just have to be willing to fight for it. You have to be willing to stand up, even when it seems like the world is telling you to sit down. The room was quiet, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Marcus could feel the energy of the crowd shifting, a sense of hope building as his message took hold. Justice isn't just about winning cases or exposing corruption, Marcus said, his voice softening slightly. It's about creating a world where everyone has an equal shot at a fair chance. It's about making sure that no one is left behind, that no one is forgotten. It's about ensuring that the truth always has a place to stand, no matter how much power tries to crush it. The fight for justice is a fight that we must all take on together. It's the fight of our lives. The crowd erupted into applause, a collective roar of approval and gratitude for the young man who had taught them that the fight for justice was a lifelong commitment, one that required not only courage, but also hope. But Marcus wasn't finished. He wasn't the kind of person who would leave it at that. He knew that words alone wouldn't change the world. Action was what mattered. You are the future of this fight, Marcus continued. The next generation of leaders, of change-makers, of warriors for truth. The world is depending on you to continue the work that has already been started. Don't let the fire of justice burn out. Keep it alive. And when the time comes, stand up, speak out, and never, ever back down. The room erupted into applause once more, this time with even more force, more energy, as Marcus stepped back from the podium. His heart was pounding, but there was a sense of peace inside him. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but he was ready. He had come too far, fought too hard, to stop now. As he walked off the stage, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Elijah, smiling wide. You did it, bro. You really did it. Marcus grinned back, the exhaustion in his bones, but the fire in his heart still burning bright. No, we did it. All of us. Vanessa stood beside them, her arms crossed and a proud smile on her face. You've come a long way, Marcus, but this is just the beginning. There's still so much to do. Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. I know, and I'm ready. As they walked out of the conference hall, the city lights flickered around them, a symbol of the world they had fought to change. Marcus Jackson had made a difference, but his journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. And as long as there were wrongs to right and justice to fight for, he would continue. The fight for truth and justice was far from over, but Marcus knew one thing for certain. The legacy he had started, the spark of hope he had ignited, would burn for generations to come.